Okay.
Okay. So after a brief discussion of what I did on my vacation, uh, we are going to discuss uh, a very interesting subject. It comes up a lot, and we're going to see some of the classic answers, and that is Satan
Oh, no, really?
in Jewish tradition, and also testing. One of the puzzling things I'm curious as we get into it. Before we get into it, I always like sort of asking what people think, and then we'll read the sources. Um, Not so much about Satan, as you'll see. Satan in the Bible is very limited. I mean, this it's he is a major actor in the book of Job, at least in the beginning and the end, and that's pretty much it. I think it may be mentioned once or twice in other places, but certainly not the kind of actor that we see in Christian thought or in the gospel according to Flip Wilson, of the role of Satan,
Yeah.
and the devil made me do it. Um, but as you will see a little bit, that aspect, that idea of Satan being sort of a tempter, and it does enter Judaism in the Talmudic period, in the medieval period. So that's kind of interesting. But here's a really interesting question. I'm curious as to what you think of it. Um, there are the article that we're going to read is the Satan provokes God into testing Job and Abraham. So there's two really interesting, I mean, these are two interesting cases, and they're more connected than you might think. But in the case of Abraham, the major test is the binding of Isaac, or the near sacrifice of Isaac. As I think we all know the story, it's one of the most difficult and troubling stories in the Bible, that God asks Abraham to go and offer his son as a burnt offering to God as a sacrifice, and Abraham seems to do it without really questioning. So the obvious question is, why does God do this? Doesn't God know what Abraham would do? Is this a reasonable thing for God to do? It's a really interesting question. And in the same way, we have a similar story in the book of Job. In the book of Job, there's an opening and a closing, which seems to be written by a different author than the bulk of the book of Job. But basically, Job is a good guy, and he's loyal and faithful. And you'll see in the story, uh, God is talking to the Satan. It's not Satan as a proper name, but Satan as a title, meaning the accuser. And and God says to Hasatan, "What have you been doing?" And he says, "He's been wandering around." And I think God says to him, "So what do you think of my servant Job? Is he a heck of a guy or what?" And Hasatan says, "Yeah, only because he has it so good. If he didn't have it so good, then he wouldn't be so loyal and faithful and reverent." And so step one is God says, "Okay, you can do terrible things to his family, but don't touch him." And so his children are dead, his livestock, his cattle, everything. Horrible stuff happens to his family, and he is still loyal. And so God basically says, "You see?" And Hasatan says, "Yeah, yeah, but you haven't touched him." So he is afflicted with some kind of terrible disease.
Oh,
In
wow.
this article, they suggest it may have been shingles, which I never have heard before, but it certainly could be. And
Boils,
and I'm
boils.
sorry.
Boils was what I recall.
Yeah, yeah, and shingles does appear as boils. So
Yeah.
anyway, it's an interesting idea. I just never heard it described as shingles. And so the question is this a reasonable thing for God to do? Does did to to Job? And of course, in the end, Job gets new kids, and to our ear, it doesn't sound like much of a compensation, but it's very, very troubling. So the article is going to probe what the classic commentators made of this, but I'm curious what you might think before we dive into this, about why would God do this to Abraham, or Job, or you and me? I mean, there's no life that I know of that's untouched by tragedy. And so, it's sort of it's a very central question in Judaism. I'm curious if anybody want to hazard a discussion or a
because
comment.
wants to show to the people that I put you in the what can I say, to a very unpleasant place to see, to you see that you still have faith to me or no.
Well, that's very interesting. So the question of showing faith in the face of adversity is not because God wants to see if you have faith, but the question is, will you continue to have faith? That's a very interesting observation.
Very good. Yeah, I like
Yeah.
that.
So Jim, and then Ken, and then Alan. Yeah, Jim.
Well, in terms of Abraham, it says right out front, flat for us, it was a test.
Yes.
So he never intended him to kill him. He was being tested. Job's a whole
Well,
other
hold
thing.
on a second. The fact that it's a test doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't going to kill him. The test is to see whether he will offer his son as a sacrifice. So I would say it's not inherent that he wouldn't kill him, but it's not a bad interpretation, though.
That God wouldn't let him kill him.
Well, we know that from the way the story turns out. But yeah, okay.
I see, yeah.
So the question is that a reasonable thing for God to do? Who was learning what from the test?
Well, reasonable. The Job thing. That's a much easier question vis-a-vis reasonable, because no, it wasn't. That wasn't reasonable at all. But when we studied that, you said that the beginning chapter was written by somebody else later on.
Yes, scholars would say the inside of Job. There's like 2 chapters where you have this bet between God and Satan. We're going to see how it turns out, and all of his children die. And then there's an end where in the end, he gets new children, still stuck with the same wife. It's just, interesting commentary.
Job would be my favorite
but it
book
seems
were it
like
not
that
for the
was
first
written by
2
a
chapters.
different author than the bulk. There are something like 40 something chapters in the book of Job. So it does seem like it may have been a way to explain what was going on in the book of Job. But I know we actually did do a detailed discussion of the book of Job once. Ken.
Well, to my understanding, Abraham was like the founder of monotheism, and he was the first one who he destroyed all the idols and believed in just one God, that there was one God. And so I think God wanted to test him to see how strong that could God rely on Abraham as a foundation of the future of the people, so he wanted to test him and see how strong it was. For Abraham, Lot, it was probably it was a similar thing, but he wasn't the founder of monotheism or anything. But just wanted to show Satan, I guess, that there still were people who were completely devoted to him.
Okay. Did you think God didn't know the answer to how the test would turn out?
I don't know. I don't know whether he knew ahead of time how it was going to turn. I think
Yeah, I mean it's an
that
important question.
yeah. Okay.
Okay. Alan.
So this feeds right into, I'm in a class on Pirkei Avot, so I'm going to read you why this connects to what you just asked us. It
Okay.
says, everything is foreseen, yet the freedom of choice is given. And so this then reflects the question of did God know? It helps me understand the fact God knows doesn't necessarily in effect trying to understand what people do.
So I think, well, I mean, that's actually a very interesting and troubling passage from Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is part of the Mishnah, which is the center of the Talmud, and says all is foreseen, yet free will is given. And so if all is foreseen, presumably by God, then God would know what Abraham would do. And then so the question is, was it reasonable for God to tell Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son? Didn't didn't God know how that test would turn out? Anyway, lots of interesting and troubling questions. I don't know if anybody else wants to make a comment, and not, we will dive into the text. Pop it up on the screen. So I think, yeah, this is from Torah.com. And I presume we can all see it. The Satan provokes God into testing Job and Abraham. And I'll read the introduction. And Joanne, if you're interested in reading, I will call upon you to do so.
Yes.
Okay. Why would God make righteous people suffer just to test their faithfulness? With Job, the Bible is explicit that it was in response to Satan's challenge. But what about Abraham? Jubilees, which is it's a Jewish book. It's not in either the Hebrew or the Christian Bible. And later Talmud and Midrash reimagined the Akedah, which is the binding of Isaac, Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, to have been instigated by Mastema, which is, I must admit, I never heard this one, which is another alternate name for Satan, or maybe a different element, Mastema, the Satan or jealous angels. The Midrash goes further and envisions the demon Samael tempting Abraham to make him fail. So in Midrash and Talmud, we have all of these characters that I would say many Jews would be surprised to know are in our sacred literature, and that's actually one of my reasons for having this session. So here's an image of the sacrifice of Isaac. There is Abraham about to slaughter his son, and an angel coming to intervene. And I don't actually see the ram. The ram is caught by his horn. One of the reasons we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is to remind God, as if God needed reminding, how loyal and faithful Abraham was. By the way, Jim, speaking of a word for Christianity, one of the Christian interpretations of the Akedah is to show how faithful Abraham was even without the Torah, right? Because the Torah is given to Moses much later in the text. So what one of the lessons of the Akedah is you can be faithful and loyal and a wonderful Jew even without worrying about all the laws of Moses, which I would say is part of an element of Christianity. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
But you said that Abraham was not a Jew because Judah had not come
So
around yet.
so yes, I would say, and I can't even call him an Israelite because Israel is his grandson. So the best description is one that somebody mentioned. He is the first monotheist. So you can be loyal to God. I appreciate your correction. You can be loyal and faithful to God without the law of Moses, which I would say is an important difference between Christianity and Judaism, where Judaism is much more focused, 613 commandments, rabbis adding thousands more, whereas Christianity is much more focused on proper faith. There's no better evidence of proper faith than this classic example where Abraham, because of his faith, is willing to sacrifice his son. And I think we'll see this in the article. Job doesn't have a choice, right? It's Abraham does have a choice. Job doesn't have a choice. Job's the only issue is his response. Okay, so
how old was Isaac that when Abraham was to kill him?
Yeah, so we don't actually know. It doesn't say. There is a clue, which is the very after this discussion in the Torah, Sarah dies. And the Midrash says when Abraham comes home and says, oh, by the way, you'll never guess what me and Isaac were up to on this little journey. And Abraham tells Sarah, after all, Sarah has Isaac when she's 90 years old. She has not been able to have a child all her life. Through the intervention of God, she becomes pregnant, has a child. And then Abraham was willing to sacrifice him. So if you say that Isaac was about the age that he is when Sarah died, because we know how old Isaac was how old Sarah was when he was born. We know how old Sarah was when she died. That would put Isaac at age 37.
Wow.
And I've heard other stories, and I think it's mentioned in here that he may have been more like 17. He's clearly old enough to carry wood. So I mean, there are some hints. Sometimes we like to image people who read the story, image Isaac as a child, but Isaac asks questions. Where's the animal to be sacrificed? And Isaac carries the wood. So he has to be at least old enough to carry the wood. So that's the only hints that we have directly from the story.
So,
And
no,
Go
sorry.
ahead, Alan.
can
So-
we say how old was Ishmael? Because
Ismael, we know is 13 years older than Isaac.
okay, so it was 30, 20, 30.
But in the Hebrew Bible, it's not Ishmael.
Yeah,
that is
but Muslim has it. So
yes.
So,
Yeah,
so,
Alan, go ahead.
so I believe the life of Sarah, the one where they report that Sarah died, he was 127, which confirms that the age of Isaac, except that do we really know how long between the Akedah? We know that we believe Abraham never spoke with Sarah again.
No, so I would say, to be precise, we don't have any record in the Torah of Abraham ever speaking with Sarah again, Abraham ever speaking with Isaac again, Abraham ever speaking with God again, which is pretty interesting.
The time between after the trip to the mountain and as you suggest, or some of the midrash suggests
Right.
that the learning of the event was such a shock it caused Sarah to die, and so implied in that would happen at the time of the return, and that would mean the Akedah would be close to when she was around 127.
Right. If because quite often there's a lot of attention in interpreting Torah to the sequence of events.
Right.
So if you take that as additional information, then Isaac was 37. And I would say that's probably the oldest you could imagine Isaac being. And the youngest would be of an age where he could ask intelligent questions and carry a lot of wood.
Right.
and by the way, we can talk about the Isaac on that scene that he could run away, he could open his hand and say, "I don't want it. Why you are want to kill me for what?" But he said nothing.
Right. So that's another interesting question. In the Torah, neither Abraham or Isaac have much of a conversation, except Isaac says, here's the wood, here is the firestone, presumably flint. Where is the animal to be sacrificed? He doesn't mention here is the knife that we can see Abraham carrying. So he can ask intelligent questions. So he has to be of an age where he would ask those questions and be capable of carrying wood. Okay, so let's start reading. I'm sure we won't get through with this tonight.
Okay, the book of Job begins with God boasting about Job's righteousness to the Satan or adversary, to which the adversary retorts that Job's apparent righteousness is due only to his wealth and happiness. But lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely blaspheme you to your face.
And I always like to take a quick look at, so English is based on standard translation with adjustments, presumably by the author.
All right. Shockingly, God allows the adversary to make the righteous Job suffer and even to kill his servants and children simply to prove the point. Hashem replied to the adversary, "See, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on him." Immediately afterwards, Job receives a succession of messengers, each one the sole survivor of a tragedy, bringing news that his livestock were consumed by fire or stolen, his herders also consumed or murdered by the raiders, and finally that his children perished when a tempest destroyed the house in which they feasted. When Job mourns,
Job.
when Job mourns but remains steadfast in his faith, God allows the adversary to afflict him with what sounds like a perpetual case of shingles.
Wow.
At this point, Job's wife suggests he just curse God and die, but Job refuses. Instead, he wholeheartedly curses the day he was born and calls God to account for his unfair treatment. His so-called friends then urge him to accept that he deserved his misfortune, but Job refuses to admit he has done anything to deserve such extreme suffering. Job's story has a happy ending in some sense, with Job's fortune being restored and more kids born. This last translates poorly to the modern ear. Even so, the book remains ambiguous as to whether God was unjust. Notably, God condemns Job's friends for speaking wrongly about innocent Job, ordering them to repent and offer sacrifices.
I want to make a point I always make in discussing the book of Job. People always talk about the patience of Job. It lasts for 2 chapters. The book has 42 chapters. So the patience of Job lasts 2 chapters, and then Job starts cursing the day he was born. He certainly acknowledges that God is all powerful, but he denies that God is just. And his friends come and tell him, well, you must have done something wrong and you must have sinned, so repent for your sins and everything will be all right. And Job refuses to do that. He basically insists on his innocence. So Job is not a particularly patient person. I'm just always want to point that out. So and a very important point, let's just read the next little verse here, 42:8.
And let Job, my servant, pray for you. For to him I will show favor and not treat you vilely, since you have not spoken the truth about me, as has my servant Job.
So this is a very important, it's not central to the thing we're talking about tonight, but I think it's very central to my understanding of theodicy, of how do we reconcile a good and loving and powerful God with evil and tragedy in the world? And that is basically Job's friends preach the central message of Deuteronomy. The central message of Deuteronomy is, if you're faithful and you obey God's law, good things will happen to you. If you disobey God's law, bad things will happen to you. It's quite simple. It's simple, but of course it's not true. At least it's not true in my opinion. And Job denies that he has done anything wrong. His friends basically say, you must have done something wrong. Otherwise, why would God, punish you in this way? And basically, God shows up at the end and fundamentally says, how can you understand my ways? Where were you when I created the universe? But God says in the passage that Joanne just read that you, speaking to his friends who are preaching simple Deuteronomy, you have not spoken the truth. It's not as simple as you do good things and God rewards you, you do bad things and God punishes you. It's more complicated than that. So I think that's a very important point. And let's read a little more.
The opening of Job does tell us it was a test, although surprisingly, the root test does not appear in the book. Job never learned that his suffering is due to the adversary's challenge, nor does God offer Job any explanation for his suffering. Instead, God speaks out of the whirlwind, overwhelming Job with the awesome and terrifying wonders of creation and reminding him of his puniness, and Job recants his challenge. So the book closes with God as inscrutable and Job rewards for his piety.
Rewarded for his piety. Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of curious that at the end, when God explains God's self, basically Job demands that God show up for a trial of Job versus God, where God is judge, jury, the accused, and and Job is just the witness. And God does show up, and basically God's response is, who are you that you think you can understand my ways? But he does say it's not as simple as you do good things, you're rewarded, you do bad things, you're punished. But God never says, oh, by the way, this really was a bet. Really sorry about this, but it was a bet between me and the adversary to see how you would react. Good job, you passed the test. We never see that in the book, which is worth pointing out as the text of this article just pointed out. Okay, now we're going to talk about the connection between Job and the Akedah, and I'll just remind you, the word Akedah means binding, and it refers to Abraham binding his son before he puts him on the altar to slaughter him.
Job builds on the Akedah. Abraham is an innocent man who suffers from unexplained reasons. Most of his life, he's unable to have children with his wife Sarah, and soon after Hashem allows them to miraculously conceive Isaac, the same God commands him to sacrifice this long-promised and beloved son. The text tells us explicitly that this was a divine trial. God tested Abraham, but offers no explanation as to why God decided on this test.
Yeah, I just want to comment on the Hebrew, which this article is going to go to town on. It says God tested Abraham, which you could certainly write Elohim nasa et Avraham. But it's not just Elohim, it's the and Ha-Elohim, the Elohim tested Abraham. So the interpreters are going to focus on that particular turn of language.
The similarities between Job and the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, are not coincidental. Judy Klitzner, The Book of Job and its paradoxical relationship with the Akedah, the Torah, goes so far as to call Job a subversive sequel. These similarities inspired early interpreters from the Book of Jubilees to Genesis Rabbah and the Talmud, borrow from Job to help explain why God put Abraham to the test. Bringing Mastima into the Akedah. The Book of Jubilees presents itself as a communication.
Okay, so it's just important. I know you can all see it, but circa, that's what CA stands for, early 2nd century BCE. So this is a very early book. I really don't know why the rabbis didn't include it in the Bible, but it is an important and surviving book, and it discusses some of these issues.
So it presents itself as a communication from the angel of the presence to Moses before he descended Mount Sinai. As James Kugel states, many of its interpretive traditions are paralleled in the Talmuds and various Midrashic collections, suggesting possible influence. Jubilees is a retelling of Genesis and Exodus up to the Sinai revelation, cutting some material and adding other material, much of which fills in Lucane in the biblical narrative.
And I think I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce this in Latin, but it's missing elements in the biblical narrative.
To explain why God tested Abraham, Jubilees make use of this introductory narrative in Job, where God's test is prompted by Satan, accuser. Jubilees envisions just such an accuser against Abraham called Mastema, which means loathing. The hook, that homiletical reading, is based on the opening phrase, which states that the test came, and it came to pass after these things, which can also be translated as after these words. But which words?
Hold on a second. I'm just going to let Rebecca back in. So the phrase in Hebrew is Vihi achar hadvarim ha'ela. And the interesting thing here is the word davar, this is the plural devarim, can mean both things and words. I always think about it as a way of underlining in Hebrew how significant words are, in that it's the same Hebrew word for word as it is for things. So normally this is translated, and it came to pass after these things, but you can also read it as it came to pass after these words. But which words? So Jubilees is going to address the question.
And it came to pass that words came in heaven concerning Abraham, that he was faithful in everything which was told him, and he loved the Lord and was faithful in all affliction. And Prince Mastema came, and he said before God, Behold, Abraham loves Isaac his son, and he is more pleased with him than everything. Tell him to offer him as a burnt offering upon the altar, and you will see whether he will do this thing. And you will know whether he is faithful in everything in which you test him.
So it actually sounds quite a bit like the book of Job, except Job never gets to, well, Job is tested. The things happen to Job. Job never makes a decision about whether his kids are going to die, just to state one thing, whether he's going to get sick. But Job's reaction is what is being tested. Here, the same thing. Mastima is basically making it very similar to the book of Job, which I think the next sentence is going to say.
One key difference between the two texts is that whereas in Job, Satan afflicts Job himself, albeit with God's permission, in Jubilees, Mastema only goads God into testing Abraham's faithfulness. Satan in the Akedah Babylonian Talmud. In the Talmud, Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra offers a similar account of God's dialogue, except with Satan instead of Mastema. After what? Rabbi Yochanan said the name of Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra after the words of Satan. As opposed to a general observation that Abraham loves his son, Satan here criticizes Abraham's behavior during the feast celebrating Isaac's weaning. As it is written, the boy grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast. Satan said in the presence of the Holy Blessed One, Master of the universe, this old man, you favored him with the fruit of the womb at 100 years old, and out of all the feast he made, he didn't have one dove or chick to sacrifice before you?
Okay, so this is it's at the heart of a lot of the response to this, and I don't think it's going to make any of us happy. Basically, what Satan is saying to God is, here, Abraham, when he was 100 years old, has a son. Sarah is 90 years old, and the text says Abraham made a great feast, but the text doesn't say that Abraham offered a sacrifice of thanksgiving to God. So Satan is saying, what kind of guy is Abraham? He's making a big feast, he's throwing a big party, but he didn't give tzedakah. I'm just adding a sort of a modern take on this. He didn't give you, God, anything, didn't give to charity. Okay?
Yeah, but there wasn't yet a commandment to sacrifice.
Details, Stephen. Yes, I absolutely agree with you. But the in the Talmud, there's a discussion that there's no before and after in the Torah. But you're absolutely right. Yes. So let's continue.
Satan's complaint reminds us that Abraham's neglect of sacrifice contrasts sharply with Job's sacrifices on behalf of his children. When a round of feast days was over, Job would send word to them to sanctify themselves, and rising early in the morning, he would make burnt offerings, one for each of them. For Job thought, perhaps my children have sinned and blasphemed God in their thoughts. This is what Job always used to do.
And so just looking, this is Job 1:5. So this is the very beginning of the story of Job. Job was so good and so loyal and so faithful. Not only did he offer sacrifices to God for himself, but after feast days, he would offer sacrifices on behalf of his kids, just in case they forgot to do so.
If Job scrupulously made burnt offerings for the health of his children, how could Abraham do less? God then comes to Abraham's defense. God said to him, he did it only for the sake of his son. If I ask him to sacrifice his son before me, he will at once sacrifice him immediately. God tested Abraham.
Yeah, so the text says God tested Abraham. Achar hadavrim ha'ela, after these either things or words. If we read it as words, the words are, as reported both in Jubilees and in the Talmud, this discussion between God and Satan.
Though we cannot trace a clear line from Jubilees to the rabbis, Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra is working with the same homiletical hook and using Job as the paradigm. Abraham complains about himself, Genesis Rabbah. Like Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra, Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra, Genesis Rabbah connects the test with the feast for Isaac, but in this case, no demonic accuser is necessary. Abraham is the one to critique himself for not offering God any sacrifices.
So again, just to keep all of our sacred texts straight, and there are a lot of them, in the earlier thing we just quoted, this is from the Babylonian Talmud. That's what the B there is. Sanhedrin, page 89b. You can look it up in Sefaria. Here, this is Genesis Rabbah. Genesis Rabbah is basically, it's Rabbah. There's a collection of books called Midrash Rabbah. Rabbah means the great collection of Midrash. And it consists actually of 10 books, one for each of the 5 books of Torah, and one for each of the 5 scrolls in the Bible. So this is from the Genesis collection, and we're going to read about what Abraham is reported to have done in Genesis Rabbah. And then also it says here, and I'm not an expert on this, but Vatican 30, and I think what that means is this particular text comes from the Vatican collections of Genesis Rabbah. The Vatican has, great libraries and stores, and when you read these texts, the Bible's text is fixed. The Masoretes fix the text. You open any Hebrew Bible anywhere in the world, and it'll have exactly the same Hebrew text. These other sacred texts in Judaism, you can find variations all over the board. In this case, they're quoting one that is in the Vatican library.
After these things, there were worried thoughts about things. What did Abraham worry? He worried and said, I celebrated and have everyone celebrate, but I did not set aside for the Holy Blessed One, bullock or one ram.
Yeah. So here it's not Satan that's arguing with God, but Abraham himself feels guilty because even though he threw a big party for his son's weaning, his son's, going off the breast and to food, that he feels guilty. And so let's see. Yeah. So
Abraham's worry mimics that of Job, though with a clear distinction. Job is worried about his children's behavior at their feasts, and therefore he offers sacrifices on their behalf, while Abraham is worried about his own behavior at his own feast. God's response is the Akedah presented to Abraham as if it were a consolation of sorts. The Holy Blessed One said to him, you did so, understanding that it will be said to you that you should sacrifice your son to me, and you will not hesitate.
so this, now there's a lot of great commentary here, and we can spend a lot of time. I'll just read this one. Both Job and the Midrash have an ironic subtext. Job, who sacrifices for his children's benefit, is about to lose them, and Abraham, who worries that he should have sacrificed offerings of thanksgiving, is about to be asked to sacrifice his son. And the author thanks somebody for pointing this out to him. So the consolation, pretty small consolation, in my opinion, is don't worry, Abraham, even though you feel bad about not making an animal sacrifice, you're going to be able to make up for it because I'm going to ask you to sacrifice your son, and you won't hesitate. Okay, now let's hear what the angels have to say about all this.
The angels complain, Genesis Rabbah alternative. Genesis Rabbah then offers an alternative version of this midrash, which is more similar to Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra in the Babylonian Talmud, except that it is not Satan complaining, but the ministering angels. And according to the opinion of Rabbi Leazar, who said, when we do not read God, but rather and the God, it refers to him and his court. The ministering angels said, this Abraham he celebrated and had everyone celebrate, but he did not set aside for the Holy Blessed One, bullock or one ram.
Yeah, there's two ones. The Holy Blessed One, one bullock, and one ram. By the way, just as kind of some fun here, you see it says the Holy Blessed One. The Hebrew here is what we're seeing here, Le Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed is He. It is a standard rabbinic way of referring to God. You don't see that phrase in the Bible at all, but you do see it in rabbinic writing. So here it's the ministering angels that are basically complaining to God that Abraham didn't even offer any sacrifice. So let's see what God's response to the ministering angels are.
God offers the same response to them that he offered to Abraham in the first version. The Holy Blessed One said to them he did so, understanding that it will be said to him that he should sacrifice his son to me, and he will not hesitate.
Yeah, and again, here we have Hakadosh Baruch Hu. There are a lot of these abbreviations. Now I'm just showing off my library. Here is a book in my library. It's entirely in Hebrew, and it's Otzia Rashi HaTevot. Rashi Tevot is an abbreviation. So in this book, there are just scores and hundreds and thousands of abbreviations. So when you're reading rabbinic literature and you don't have Sepharia, which I didn't have when I bought this book, I mean, Sepharia didn't exist, and you see an abbreviation in a commentary, you look it up, it's alphabetized, and at least you can see what it is in Hebrew, just like NASA is National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So, I mean, we know HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but there's a lot of these abbreviations, and just one of the joys of now having Sepharia is you don't need to know what all these abbreviations stand for. Okay, let's see. I think we're up here. Are we here?
These variations, these variations on the Akedah's opening, inspired by Job, are all attempting to explain why God tests Abraham. Once the theme of a demonic power's involvement in the story was incorporated, and the rabbis made use of it elsewhere in the Akedah as well. Samuel tempts Abraham.
That's Samael.
Samael.
It's not Samuel. Just
yeah. All right.
Okay.
Samuel tempts Abraham. As they approach the mountain, Isaac inquires about the sacrifice. Then Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he answered, "Yes, my son." And he said, "Here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" As Genesis Rabbah envisions Isaac as at least a teenager, if not a full adult.
Yeah, let's just read the text here. In many rabbinic texts, the rabbis assume here Isaac is 37 in the story based on the assumption that Sarah dies upon hearing of the Akedah. He is born when Sarah is 90 years old, and she dies in the very next story at 127, which is why the Midrash understood her reaction on hearing the news of the Akedah. Therefore, thus Isaac must have been 37 when it took place. Okay, let's continue. This is clear.
As Genesis Rabbah envisions Isaac as at least a teenager, if not a full adult, this is clear from Genesis Rabbah's presentation of his argument with Ishmael in the previous chapter. The Midrash is bothered by why he sounds so childlike. So Genesis Rabbah creates a backstory to this conversation to give it context, in which the demonic being Samael tries to dissuade both father and son, beginning with Abraham.
Let me just take a look at some of the footnotes. Let's see the next one. Samael is often mentioned as a demonic figure in Second Temple literature, and also appears in late Amoraic texts. Amoraic texts are the texts in the Talmud. We have the Talmud is Mishnah and Gemara. The rabbis who are quoted in the Gemara, the commentary on the Mishnah, are called the Amoraim. So it's later texts in the Talmud. of which Genesis Rabbah appears to be the first, and then he has his sources. So Samael came to our father.
Samael came to our father Abraham. He said to him, "What, old man, have you lost your mind? A son that was given to you at 100 years, you are going to slaughter him?" He said to him, "I understand the consequences."
So this is really, there's an interesting phrase. I think this is going, yeah. So I'll just read this. The Hebrew itself, almanat ken, has a troubling resonance with Tosefta Sanhedrin. Tosefta is some of the commentary on the Mishnah, which discusses instances in which the death penalty cannot be imposed unless the guilty party has been warned that he intends a capital crime and says, "I know and I act with this understanding." Let's see. Yodea ani, I know, but almanat kain ani oseh. And almanat kain, and there I'm doing this with understanding the consequences. This is actually a part of Jewish law. It's a commentary on how how uncomfortable the rabbis were with capital punishment. And capital punishment, to inflict capital punishment on a murderer, for example, you have to have two witnesses to the murder, the actual murder, and the two witnesses have to ask the murderer before he commits the murder that do you realize that you're about to commit a capital crime? And the murderer says, "I know and I act with this understanding." So in practice, it was very difficult to impose capital punishment in rabbinic times. But the reason I'm emphasizing this is we're going to see this phrase repeated over and over again in the text that follows. We'll read a little more and then we'll take a break. So Samael, which think of it as like a demonic figure, says to Abraham, "Are you nuts? A son was given to you at 100 years, and you're going to slaughter him?" And he says, "Almanat kain. I understand the consequences."
Seeing that Abraham stands firm, Samael targets Abraham's trust in God, alluding indirectly to his many trials, and implying that Abraham has been tried more than enough already. Perhaps it also raises the possibility that God intends to test Abraham indefinitely with more and more terrible trials, and follows up his question with a quote from the book of Job. He said, "And if he tests you more than this, can you withstand it? If he tests you with this thing, will you weary?" He said, "Yes, more than this."
Yoter man kain. So apparently this is a quote from Job 4.2. Okay.
In quoting Job, Samael may be inviting Abraham to consider whether his trial, like Job's, might be based on a one-time contest between God and Satan, thus lacking cosmic purpose. But again, Abraham simply replies yes, asserting his utter determination to God's will, whatever it may be. Samael tries one more time, arguing that Abraham leaves himself open to entrapment. He said to him, "Tomorrow he will say to him, 'You are a shedder of blood, guilty. You spilled his blood.'" He said to him, "I understand the consequences."
Again, almanat kain. Samael is saying, God tells you to slaughter your son. Tomorrow he's going to say you're a murderer. And Abraham is still faithful.
Samael then gives up on Abraham and turns to Isaac. Since Samael did not succeed at all, he came over to Isaac. At first, Samael fares no better with the son than with the father. He said, "What is this, son of an unfortunate woman? He is going to slaughter you." He said to him, "I understand the consequences."
So Samael is trying to basically talk Isaac out of going willingly, and Isaac is definitely going willingly.
Samael continues to call Isaac's poor mother to his mind, now adding sibling rivalry into the mix. He said to him, "If so, will all those fancy tunics your mother made go to Ishmael, the enemy of your house, as an inheritance?" This time, Samael strikes a chord. What does not succeed in full may succeed in part. This is why then Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father, why does the verse have his father twice? To make Abraham full of pity for him. Samael does not succeed in making Abraham or even Isaac turn back, although he does make the latter waver just a bit and question his father like a small child.
So this is the story trying to explain why Isaac says, basically, I see all the implements for an animal sacrifice, but where's the animal? I think I'll read a little more. Well, yeah, let's read a little more. I think we can finish this. We'll go over a little bit.
The angel needs to stop Abraham from strangling Isaac. Calling to Abraham from heaven, the angel emphasizes not laying a hand on Isaac. And he said, Do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. Picking up on the reference to Abraham's hand, the Midrash asks, Where was the knife? The Midrash answered that the knife dissolved in the angel's tears. Tears had fallen on it from the ministering angels and dissolved it. One would think that the sudden disappearance of the knife would give Abraham pause, but instead, as if he put everything he has into steeling himself to complete the sacrifice, he is about to push forward anyway. This is why the announcement comes from the heavens telling him to stop. Abraham said to him, Then I will strangle him. The angel said to him, Do not raise your hand against the lad. Even now it is not over, since Abraham believes he must at least do something so as not to make the almost sacrificial act worthless. He said to him, Let us draw a drop of blood from him. He said, Do not do anything to him. One can hardly help wondering what Isaac was thinking throughout this tragically absurd dialogue.
So what the Midrash is doing is something that Midrash does a lot. The text actually says that the angel stops him and says, Do not lift your hand, the boy, or don't do any harm to him, and don't even make a mark upon him. And so the Midrash is questioning why that language, and they're answering it in very fanciful terms. They're saying the tears of the angels dissolve the knife. So what does Abraham do? Instead of realizing, well, this is God's way of stopping the sacrifice, he said, I'll beat him to death. I'll strangle him. And you know, it's kind of classic Midrash just going to town. Let's read a little more and then we'll call it a night.
Did God really learn something about Abraham? Jubilees. The angel's speech in the Torah continues by saying that now he knows that Abraham fears God. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, you favored one from me. In Jubilees, the angel who stops Abraham is none other than the angel dictating the book of Jubilees to Moses, and God tells him explicitly to stop Abraham in a speech that does not appear in the Torah. And I stood before him and before Prince Mastema, and the Lord said, Speak to him. Do not let his hand descend upon the child, and do not let him do anything to him, because I know that he is one who fears the Lord.
How do the Rams feel about this?
Out of the Rams? Are we talking about the football team or
No, the animals. The species where one of them was sacrificed in place of Isaac?
Yeah, we don't know. What'd you have for dinner tonight, Stephen? I had, let's see, no, I had beef, and I don't know how the cow felt about that. Oh, gee, I'll read a little more. God does not say here, now I know, but just I know, implying that God has always known, but was trying to demonstrate this fact to the angels, good and bad. This is why the angel says, now I know, to Abraham, rather than repeating God's exact words. And I called to him from heaven, and I said to him, Abraham, Abraham. And he was terrified and said, Hineni, here I am. And I said to him, Do not put forth your hand against the child, and do not do anything with him, because now I know you are the one who fears the Lord, and you did not deny your firstborn son to me. Oh. In other words, God knows all along, but the angel of the presence just finds out now, as does Mastema, who instigated the accusation in the first place, and Prince Mastima was shamed. The claim that God had always known and the test was simply a demonstration for the benefit of Mastima and the angel of presence solves the theological conundrum of God learning something new. I think I'm going to stop the discussion and I'll just ask Alan, I'm going to close the.
So this last point sort of answers the question we wrestled with at the beginning, which is why did God ask Abraham to to sacrifice his son? It seems like that this last thing you read answers the question. It was to
Yeah,
prove,
he was doing it for the benefit of Mastima, this evil angel, and the angel of the presence.
but that's not the only answer. People do have other comments.
Oh yeah, there's lots of answers, including that Abraham failed the test, that God didn't want him to sacrifice it, and there's even people who would say God failed the test. I mean, the Akedah is the subject of endless
Yeah.
discussion. Jim.
Why did they wonder where the knife went? Because Abraham would have needed it to kill the ram in the sacrifice. So why did they think, oh, where'd the
Well,
knife go?
yeah, so the thing is the angel says, or God says to him, do not put forth your hand against a child and do not do anything to him. In fact, I think it literally says, do not even make a mark upon him. So it's odd language. I mean, God could have just said, don't slaughter him. But he goes on and says, don't do anything, don't even make a mark upon him. So the Midrash is trying to explain that by saying that even if the knife was gone, God was, didn't want him to hurt him at all. There's a joke. I almost hesitate to quote this one, but you know me. They apparently they were testing some I guess some women for a CIA, assassins job, and they had three women they were going to test, and they tell each woman, here's a loaded gun. I want you to go in there and shoot your husband. And the first two, go in, and there's silence, and then there's crying, and then they don't they didn't shoot him. The third woman, they sent her into the room. There are shots fired, a whole bunch of shots. Basically, the other thing I should have explained, the gun really wasn't loaded. There were blanks in the gun. So the third woman, they send her in, they hear the shots, and then beyond just the shots being fired, there's a battle going on. People are crashing and furniture is crashing and so on. And she comes out and they said, what happened? And he said, and her response was, well, some idiot loaded blanks in the gun, so I had to beat him to death.
Oh no.
At close enough range, a gun with blinks will still
Yeah,
kill
yeah.
someone.
But it doesn't work in the joke. So, which is, of course, really the important thing.
Some versions of the joke, the gun isn't loaded in order to get around that problem.
No. But, well, anyway, I can't remember exactly how the joke goes. But that's the idea here, is that even if God had removed the knife, and there's a lot of discussion about the angel's tears. There's one midrash that says the angel's tears were in Isaac's eyes, and that's what made Isaac, blind later in life.
Wow.
And so there's all kinds of great midrash. Midrash just adds to the story. Studying midrash is wonderful, and one of the things we saw earlier is you might have successive midrashim about a particular story, and they don't even necessarily agree with each other. But it's just like us sitting around here trying to imagine what actually happened. The rabbis are sitting around trying to explain what happened, and they come up with these, wild variations. Okay, Lois, yeah.
I'm just wondering, the writers of the Torah before Midrash, what kind of a God were they trying to present? Is it based on some other models? I mean, it's so different than what we think of, that a God should be just and a God should be loving and protective. And here he is in this story sitting around with his cronies talking about, playing with humans. And
Okay, well, that's Midrash. So if you're asking, I mean, my understanding of Torah is there were stories that were told about our understanding of God, and then at some point these stories get written down. So if I interpret your question, the, this presumably the Akedah was a story that was being told about Abraham and Isaac. And what was the point of having such a story? And one answer, I mean, I don't know, Farah, if you wanted to speculate on an answer before I do. Were you going to say something, Farah?
Yes, I want to say this Midrash people that talk, uh, who was there? Who were so many people? Because it was not 10 or 12 or I don't know how many people. And who okayed them? Like we say, Moses, God was with God. God okayed it. And the other things that they say the angels, but how they show the angels in the present of a woman or a man.
So the angels are understood to be messengers, divine beings. They talk about God having a host of heavenly uh, creatures hanging around. You know,
Yeah.
when God says, "Let us make humanity in our image," the traditional Jewish answer is God was talking to the angels.
But yeah, but we see that even this day, they said that the chief of the Chabad sometimes give us some rules or something for the Jewish. So who are they? Who were they that?
Okay, let me address Lois's question. So the way I would guess this is they were telling stories about what is the nature of God, and they wanted to make a very powerful example that Judaism does not accept human sacrifice. So to make this story very powerful and memorable, they include the story of the Akedah, which has this great tension of whether Abraham will actually go through with a human sacrifice. He apparently is willing. And we know, in other religions that people would sacrifice their own children. We know that from the god Moloch, god of fire, that people would sacrifice their own children to the god of fire. So I would say this is a very powerful story which emphasizes that God doesn't want us to sacrifice humans to God, only animals. And I would say this story was their way of explaining that. Um, that would be my
yeah,
guess.
but I find that it still doesn't,
So
for
remember,
me,
it's in a world. It's in a world where everybody knows you should sacrifice people. That's the way
I'm
religion.
like, what kind of a God are they representing? And does he or she stay the same over the Torah? Is the image of the character of this character in the Torah change? And how do we look at it now? Can we believe in something like this? Besides trying to do what you just did, like twist ourselves in a pretzel to explain why God would ask you to sacrifice your child.
Right,
I mean, I can barely get through it every high
right,
holidays.
right. So and it's interesting. We read this on Rosh Hashanah. This is not a story that we're trying to suppress. This is a story the rabbis are trying to emphasize.
Right.
So I would say, so first I would say that in answer to your question, um, pious Jews might say God is unchanging. I would say in the course of the Torah, God is clearly not unchanging. That, I talk about this a lot, that the Torah opens with faith in God is one of monolatry, not monotheism, that there are lots of gods and our God is the top God. And as the Bible goes on and we get to the prophets are emphatic in saying there are no other gods. All the other gods are false gods. So what I would say is the Torah is the record of the evolution of our understanding of God. And in the early stages, we understand God as being a lot like other gods. Some important differences. The creation of the universe is a quiet, orderly one, resulting in humanity that God is understood to be a God of justice. You know, Abraham, in arguing for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, argue that God cannot act unjustly. But we're starting off with a belief in God that is based on the times where everybody understood what the gods do. There are lots of gods, and they're playful, and they're not just. And our understanding of God evolves. You know, in a way, we could compare it to the evolution of our republic and our democracy. You know, when our republic starts out, everybody understands that there's slavery and that women shouldn't get the vote and that children are chattel and property and women are chattel and property and slaves are property. And this is our understanding. And as the United States develops, our understanding of what is right and appropriate evolves. And I certainly see that happening in the Torah. And you know, these stories of Midrash are struggling with the fact that they're going to take every word of Torah as being literally true, yet they have to reconcile it with their understanding of God. And how do they, you know, twist themselves in pretzels, in your words, which I like pretzels.
But my question is, who are those people that wrote the Midrash? And
they're rabbis. They're rabbis in the Talmudic.
Who okayed these rabbis?
Who what?
Who okayed that rabbis?
They okay each other. Who okayed me? Wait a minute, Farah. I'm ordained by rabbis. So the rabbis ordained each other. So Judaism starts out, there's no mention of rabbis in the Bible. The concept of rabbi does not exist in the Bible. Okay? So the authority, the religious authority in the Bible goes with the priests. With the destruction of the temple, there's no role for priests. There's no more animal sacrifice. So we have a group of teachers who are going to come up with an understanding of how are we to continue Judaism without a temple and without a priesthood. And we call these folks rabbis because the word rabbi means my teacher. And so basically their authority is one based on scholarship and being ordained by other rabbis. And that continues to this moment. I mean, you know, there's such a thing as, I refer to it as ordination by Vistaprint. Okay, there is my business card. I assure you that Vistaprint, from whom I purchased this card, did not ask to see my ordination certificate before they were willing to declare me a rabbi. So you too can be a rabbi. Just place an order with Vistaprint. So that's of course not the way it works. In the movement that I'm part of, I'm looking right above the screen here. I went to rabbinical school for 5 years, and so I became a rabbi based on my scholarship and based on my acceptance by the faculty of Hebrew Union College. So the authority is vested in the rabbis. You don't like it? That's fine. You don't have to like it. But I'm telling you, that's Judaism. So where do we get the authority? By interpreting the religious text in a very careful, methodical, and holy way, in the sense that these rules are actually laid out in the Talmud.
Thank you,
Alan.
I'm just going to add, although you weren't really going to go too far this way, that one of the advancements of the creating of rabbinic Judaism and in the role of the rabbi was to remove the hereditary relationship that the priest, and that's in my opinion, important thing.
It goes from a hereditary authority, which is the priesthood, the son of a priest is a priest, to a meritocracy. You're a rabbi based on your merit. And we now have, you know, when issues of Jewish law come up post-Talmudic, there are things called responsa, which are basically rabbinic decisions. And you know, in modern times, we have committees in the conservative movement and in the reform movement. But throughout history, it was based on the reputation and the merit of a rabbi. So a rabbi who is known to be very wise and well respected, when he issued, and I use the word he because it was only guys, when he issued a ruling that ruling was accepted, not necessarily by everybody. So you have,
Yeah.
Chabad has their own rulings, and other movements have their own rulings. But
When my
it is.
business card is finished coming back and says Commander in Chief, does that mean I can solve the Iran problem?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, all you need is a business card, and I have an answer.
Yes. Just have
And so in Iran, the issue in Iran, or there is, I have this other guy has his approach. He's called the president, and he's got a business card. I could go get a business card, and I could solve it differently.
Good luck with that. Okay, I wish you all a good evening. And I think there's a little more in this article. You can read it on your own. There's a couple of interesting articles I discovered as I was preparing for tonight about afterlife for animals. And do dogs go to heaven? So a couple of good articles. I was on a panel about this a few weeks ago and found some articles. So we'll take a look at those articles next time.
Monday
we're having a class. We are going to read an article about the book of Ecclesiastes. And my hope is that we'll actually do a detailed long-term study of the book of Ecclesiastes, an amazing and fascinating book. So I wish you all a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Okay.
Thanks, Rabbi. Welcome home.
Thank you. Take care.